Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Tanya Cribb. I'm the gallery director, or the museum director rather, at the Plattsburgh State Art Museum. And I am delighted to welcome you to celebrate the spirit of Rockwell Kent today. This has been long overdue and much anticipated to have a celebration of Rockwell Kent. We are so very fortunate to have this incredible body of Rockwell Kent's work here at Plattsburgh. Welcome also to those of us who are joining us via webinar. We're grateful to have you with us as well. I'm very excited about the lectures and our guests that are here. This lecture is called Pursuing Beauty in Bewilderment at its Profusion, Reflections on Gender and Sexuality in Rockwell Kent's Greenland Materials. And we will be hearing from Susan Vanek and Jette Rygaard. And Jette is here with us today from Greenland. And we are very happy to have her. And Susan will be joining us remotely. Jette is an emeritus assistant professor and former head of the Department of Language, Literature, and Media at the University of Greenland. And Susan completed her master's degree at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and is currently a PhD candidate in sociocultural anthropology at Binghamton University. So without further ado, we welcome both Susan and Jette, and we'll turn it over to you.
I think I got my own.
Yep, she's gonna have to.
I just wanted to fix this one. Is it good? No? You can't hear anything.
That one's the one for the,
I think the one is
Camera.
better. So I
and then,
shift it.
oh, that's because he's recording.
Okay,
So I think-
should I have both?
If it's possible.
Please help me.
Yes,
Absolutely.
We will.
Yeah. And I need the other one as well.
Yep, both of them. That one's for in-person and for the
Okay.
webinar.
Please put.
Right. So
I don't have any, yeah, I
no
put,
pockets.
no, I didn't think about focus.
That's
but
all right. And
No, I
any
can-
pockets on the back of
If you
the.
take this one, I can, I put it back. Oh, I'm sorry. Ja. Jeg skal bare lige have alt det her på. Jeg sætter det op her.
So one down.
No, it's not down. Oh, it's cold. And another, yeah. I hope I don't jump. So now you can hear everything. Yeah, I think I'll try that one. Oh, another time I should have pockets. Could you help me? Yeah. Could you help me?
Yeah.
I can see. So feel free to do whatever you like. Yeah, in some reasons.
Not too fresh.
Not too fresh. So, okay. Is it good?
Yeah, that is. Okay.
So, hello, can you hear me? Is it good? Can I? Yes. Hello. So, I'm good. Put it here. Yes. Susan and I am going to talk about this, as Tanya said, pursuing beauty in the bewilderment and its profusion. And, oh, how? No. Is it, what? You can't hear me? Okay. Can't hear me. Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? I think it should be closer to my mouth. Is it good? Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Much better, good. So Susan would introduce herself. Are you there, Susan?
Yep. Okay. So today we're going to discuss the representation of Greenlandic women in Rockwell Kent's writings on the country, particularly his book Salamina, which was published in 1935, with additional material from his later Greenlandic journal, published in 1962, and Enbai, as well as information gathered from several archives, including unpublished letters written by Kent and his contemporaries. So we've already kind of been introduced. Only thing I can add is that I've been in and out of Greenland for about 10 years, both from a PhD research and as part of the Rockwell Kent project. And Jette?
Yeah, I had my degree from the Copenhagen University. I was born there, and then I had a PhD from Denmark, another place in Denmark. And I've been working at Ilsmortosarfik, the Greenlandic University, for 30 years. And I have been doing visual studies, literature, media, and I have been working a lot with children about visual things, visual anthropology. Yeah.
Okay, the presentation we are giving today is the product of the broader Rockwell Kent and early 1930s Greenland project. Not yet, Jette. Funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation's Arctic Social Science Program. The project was a collaborative study that combined visual, historical, and anthropological methodologies to approach how social, cultural, and environmental changes and continuities are constructed and experienced in Greenland. As part of the project, interviews were conducted with community members in the towns of Thorsvit, Sissemut, Umanak, and Nuuk. Kent's photos were both used as a means to talk about Kent and ask about his time in Greenland, as well as jumping off points to talk about changes in Greenland. We also had extensive archival and historical research, as well as photo workshops with youth in Greenland. The research team consisted of Dennis DeFiba, who was the PI, Jette Rygaard, myself, and Axel Jeremiasen, who were co-PIs. So what are we going to talk about today? We've had a few people already ask us how we came to this topic and how we're going to address it. In researching Kent and reading his writings, we were struck by his presentations of women in Greenland, depicting them as beautiful and unmoral, caretakers of men and objects of desire. We decided to analyze this further, but the question was how? All the women that Kent had known in Greenland have passed away. They didn't leave written diaries or letters. And there are few people in communities today that Kent had visited that remember Kent. And those that did were very young children at the time. In addition, his book Salamina was never translated into Greenlandic, the main language of the country. And the Danish translation, which is the second language in Greenland, received only limited release in Denmark in the 1930s. So most people we spoke to had never read Kent's writings, and we could not ask them what they thought of them. So how do we as researchers approach such a one-sided account? We decided to explore Kent's presentation of Greenlandic women in relation to other representations of Indigenous Arctic women prominent in popular Western media at the time. What they tell us about broader representations of the Arctic and their continued legacy of such representations today. We follow a framework following the works of scholars such as Pratt and her work on called Imperial Eyes that focuses on travel writing, Said's Orientalism, and other such scholarship that stress the need to approach historical materials like Kent's, not as objective depictions of people or places, but as situated products of interaction. Travel writings such as these, the scholars point out, at their core are the construction and examination of the self vis-a-vis the other. Our research is also informed by Bloom's Gender on Ice, which highlights not only the necessity of examining issues of gender, race, and ethnicity in constructions of the Arctic, but also their links to colonialism and nationalism. We do not explore Kent's work through an Indigenous or Greenlandic lens. We cannot. It would be wonderful if others could explore Kent's work from many different perspectives, but we provide what we can provide and then hope others can draw on it and dispute it or add to it or whatever. Okay, next slide, please. So representations of the Arctic. The contemporary Arctic has emerged from a patchwork of overlapping and often contradictory representations, existing simultaneously today as a cold, inhospitable region to conquer, a fragile ecosystem to protect, an area of untapped resources to exploit, and the homeland of Indigenous peoples to preserve. This cacophony of ideas and images has coalesced over time, some shaped by the relatively recent environmental and Indigenous rights movements of the 1970s and 80s, while others arose from a long history of northern exploration, exploitation, and conquest. For most of the world's population, the Arctic existed as an exotic, distant, and often alien landscape well into the 19th century, serving as a theater for perilous expeditions, scientific endeavors, and technological innovations. This sensationalized exploits of explorers and scientists, framed as national heroes, and often serving as proxies for rivalries between states, brought the region into greater relief throughout the 19th and 20th century, transmitted to the public through press, travelogues, literature, exhibitions, drawings, and later in photographs and movies. Next slide, please.
Susan, could you please remove the mic a little because it makes noises here?
Okay,
Yeah,
is that better? Okay.
No, that was too
No.
much. A little, but try
Better?
again.
How's that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, next slide, please. Yep. As the Arctic became increasingly visible, so did the indigenous populations of the region. Once depicted as largely uninhabited, the peoples of the Arctic were increasingly included in representations of the North. Sometimes depicted as savage, but often repositioned as childlike, innocent, and peaceful, free from the corrupting influences of modernity, but highly susceptible to their lures. These imaginings of Arctic peoples, as Fina Priordan in her book Freeze Frame has written, are far from unbiased or neutral observations of the Arctic or indigenous people, but instead are positioned, the product of power, privilege, class, position, and racialized ideologies. Indigenous people in such products are often placed in the role of exotic other vis-a-vis the West. They are a more natural or essential people, bound to the environment and relics of human origin, locked outside of time and frozen. This representation was often employed as an opposite to the West, a sort of baseline for humanity through which the West can be compared and progress analyzed. Next slide, please. Into this messy conglomeration of representations of the North, and propagated through various forms of media, is the image of the polar explorer. Building on a foundation laid over centuries of imperialism and colonialism, the explorer came to take on mythic qualities. And the white male explorer, although there were exceptions, that ventured out of the comforts of home to face the savage unknown in pursuit of territory, resources, wealth, and scientific knowledge. These figures became proxies for nations in the late 19th and early 20th century in international contests such as the race for the poles, and the embodiment of late 19th and early 20th century ideas of masculinity, a figure of high adventure, bravery, danger, and romance. Next slide, please. These representations of the Arctic as frozen, hostile, and dangerous, indigenous people as representations of nature, and this myth of the explorer became fixtures in popular media in the early 20th century, in books, newspapers, and cinema. The Arctic international melodrama, for instance, popular from the 1920s and into the 1960s, provide particularly visible examples of these tropes and their persistence. Early films such as Eskimo Baby, produced in 1918, was a fish out of water comedy, with the humor arising from a fictitious Greenlandic woman brought to Denmark, where her naivete and childlike curiosity caused mishaps and misunderstandings. Films such as SOS Iceberg showcased the Arctic explorer and scientist fighting against the harsh climate and Inuit as helpful people of the land. While later films such as Igloo, Savage Innocence, and Red Snow exploit ideas of indigenous peoples as simple, childlike, but also highly sexual, especially women, and unrestrained from the morality of the West. Neglecting cultural differences between indigenous people, long histories of interaction, cultural change, and innovations, indigenous people of the North were coded in such accounts as remnants of humanity's past, taking away their histories as well as the complexities of their culture and societies, including ideas of gender, sexuality, and sex. We examine Rockwell Kent's representations of Greenlandic women as part of this broader representation of women in the Arctic. Next slide, and it's Jette.
So we will concentrate here on the representation of women in Kent's Salamina, written for a broad American audience in the 1930s. supplemented by archival material as well as the Greenlandic journal, a less edited version of the diary upon which Salamina was based. Although named for Kent, Greenlandic's Kifak, loosely translated to housekeeper, Kent himself is the central character in Salamina. His everyday life and adventures, as well as that of the male Greenlanders, which he alternately frames as hero of a harsh environment and compatriots as well as naive, former nature-like children, slowly in the process of being corrupted by modernity, formed the bulk of the work, as well as his occasional discussion of the Danish colonial administration and its employers, which he credits for the corruption of the Greenlandic society. When approaching Salamina, it is important to remember it was written for mass appeal and for an American audience in the 1930s. As Kent writes in his opening of the book, I quote, "At any rate, that is what the story is about, that and much more. Adventure, romance, brave men and beautiful unmoral women. Good Lord, this is the 20th century and I must lure on the gentle reader. In short, great stuff. Pulling on extra existing representations of the Arctic and Inuit peoples to entice readers." Kent was one of a series of explorers that traveled to Greenland in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Sensational characters that were the subject of national and international attention for their exploits in the North. These figures embody the myth of the polar explorer much in the same way Kent did. Even Kent's entrance to Greenland was described as an adventure in his book North by East. Kent suddenly had an opportunity to sail to Greenland with two younger friends on the ship direction, which ended in a shipwreck on the coast of West Greenland. However, Kent was not deterred, but eager to return and explore this closed country, including Islorsuit and Unknown Island in northwest Greenland, on the recommendation of the Danish explorers he met while en route via ship to Copenhagen after the shipwreck. It was Peter Freuchen and Knud Rasmussen. Oh, you probably know many of the names here, but I don't want to go through them. It was just to tell you, you can see the red lines, which were the explorers' favorite routes. They wanted to get first everywhere. So you probably know many of them. You can see Robert Perry on the top, you can see Nansen, and you can see Matthew Henderson, which in fact, it was disputed. He was the first. Then you see Peter Freuchen, and you can see Knud Rasmussen and Richard E. Byrd. It's probably well-known people to you. Here we see Kent's description of his shipwreck. You already know it. You see it down here to it's my left, it's your left too, yes. Directors anywhere near, quickly undoing the sack. I got out the movie camera. Listen, even above the noise of the sea and wind and rain, I hear for a short minute its small whirring like the beating of a heart. And by that sound, what happened here in Caretakers Fjord of Greenland at 11 in the morning of July 15, 1929, achieved soundless immortality. All travel to and from Greenland was recorded by the colonial administration. The first visit and his shipwreck is noted as, you can see it, well, you couldn't read it, but it's in the book we found in Sessimute. The American artist, Mr. Rockwell Kent, arrived in his own vessel with two companions to Greenland to conduct artistic studies. To return to Greenland for his first extended stay, Kent has to ask permission from the Danish government, and his travel, which was also logged. Mr. Kent went to Greenland with MS Disco mainly for winter stays at Umanak to conduct studies on the lives and conditions of the population. Greenland, as a closed country, remained that way until 1950. So you had to have permission. Kent's description of his lawsuit follow on from a famous Greenlandic politician called Lars Emil Johansen, who was born in the settlement, who saw the settlement as dark, isolated, and potentially dangerous. Kent talks about dangerous rock slides, and when we from the Kent project visited the settlement, the inhabitants talked a lot about rock slides and snow avalanches that had cost young men their lives. In 2017, the settlement was hit by a tsunami which shut it down for habitation for good. Kent built his house up the hillside to get a view of the settlement, the inhabitants, and the sound. And I quote, "I had hoped to be an observer in Greenland rather than to be one observed, and naturally preferred looking down on others to be looked up upon." However, he was aware that he lived just below a potential rock slide, and the dry land and the mountain space, to judge from the rocks that litter it, would be no safer than a battlefield. Those rocks, prior to the mountain faced by the frost, released in spring, were a perennial menace to rear ward houses to the settlement, which was Kent's also. Some houses had been struck and one not long before almost demolished. A continual reminder of how destruction might come without warning upon a sleeping household. It was a quote from Kent. Here we see on this picture, I think it's better when I look down. Here we see a picture of Kent's house to the left and the sod house he built to the right. He built this for his son, the sod house, but he would go there to be able to work during daytime. And on the upper right side, you see Salamina in her red boots, and you see the house inside Salamina and a friend and the Kent sitting by the lamp. Few people alive today remember Kent as a person, but a few elders that were children were able to tell us what they remembered. When asked about Rockwell Kent, Martin Bertelsen right away said they known him as Kriliasordog, the one who is looking up to the sky. According to him, since the man keep looking up the sky, it was an interview we made in 2016 in Sissimut with Martin Bertelsen. Often they also called him Kente or Kente 20 because he complained a lot about missing nails to build his house. We also heard that in interviews, and you can read about it in Salamina. Here we see a previous unknown illustration by Kent that was found in a guest book in the Sissimut Museum. It said Inuk Luana, and it means farewell or you must have a good time. I think it's a wonderful Greenlandic girl. I don't know, do any of you know of this picture? Yeah? Yeah, good. So Islorsuit became for Kent a paradise on earth. On the one hand, the magnificent and harsh nature suited as a motive for his canvases, and on the other hand, he found in the Greenlandic way of life a realization of his socialist communist ideology. For Kent, Greenland society had been pure and communal before the advent of the Danes, which he blamed corrupting the once ideal society. However, Greenland remains close to what Kent's ideal society, that is, in Islorsuit, it was far away. Kent found a welcoming unfolding of what might be called his cursed libido. We have heard that from several sources. In his own description, many of the women loved him, from the oldest dance mice like Beate to the slightly simple-minded like Justine, to Pauline, to Anna, and to Salamina. There is a beautiful story of the simple-minded Justina you see here. She was dirty and she had no self-respect, and she was, not regarded as a good woman. And Kent, he helped her in a lot of ways, giving her clothes and things so she could be beautiful. And Salamina helped wash her, and she became a proper beautiful woman. And she got a real job in Umanak as a helper at the hospital. So it did some good. We see in Kent's books a lot of focus on appearance, sexuality, and women's roles in relation to men. And this is illustrated in these passages we see here. I quote, "She was fair to look at, good to dance with, impossible to talk to, and completely stupid." Another quote goes, "She had abundant beauty, long braids of raven hair, coiled heavily about her head, and an olive skin, red lips, and teeth as white as sun-bleached ivory." Another goes, "Her narrow eyes were as true drawn by a master's hand with firm, strong, delicate precision. Her nose, we leave that out, her maker nearly did. Her mouth was, would I say, cute, no doubt about that." Another said is the pagan girl, "How little has 200 years of Christ of affected what 10,000 ungenerated years, 10 times that, had made her. Say what we will of truth and beauty, emanating as the light from heaven. God abode, the trade as the pagan earth, her roots were there, its moisture oozed through her feet and nourished her. Her race, ancient ways lived on her. Beauty is strength, its poet might have said, strength is beauty. Men would by force. Rape was ritual that crowned a courtship. She could little fall for words or give herself as a young tree could bend towards the wind." Kent was adamant to the romantic love in the Western sense did not exist in Greenland, with marriage and sex based on supporting the social unit and satisfying desires and the needs of procreation. Reminiscent in many ways of wider depictions of Arctic peoples as somehow naive, but also highly sexual humanity in a purer form before it came encumbered by modernity and Christianity. And I quote, "Love as we understand it, as we fabricators throughout the centuries of the now top-heavy structure of romantic love have made ourselves believe it to be. It is all but unknown in Greenland. It is through the interdependence of the sexes, both for the satisfaction of their sexual appetites and for the performance of the routine of living, had no need of romantic stimulant. They fornicate, they like to. They mate, they have to. And mutual possessiveness with its attendant jealousy, which is virulent in Greenland, only appears as to safeguard of the economic partnership and its biological result, the family." Kent was particularly concerned with connecting jealousy to romantic love, which he was adamant did not exist in Greenland, and which he was himself immune. Jealousy did exist in Greenland, according to Kent, but it was only the result of the possible breakup of the economic or biological partnership. I quote, "Jealousy, jealousy, the fear of losing to another what is ours, is so closely woven into the fabric of romantic love that only those of us who don't much care or who are preternaturally wise and self-controlled are free of it." Unquote. And here we have Anna's story served as a good example of some of these patterns in the writings about women. Wise, I quote, wife of Johan, Anna is described as neither young, no sweet thing, nor beautiful. She worked as Kent's kifak, as a housekeeper, before Salamina. He explains his reason for needing a housekeeper as, I quote, the friends of men might feel for that unfortunately for any cause or anywhere who's left womanless. There's nothing brave in living by yourself unless one wants to make heroic virtue out of housework. I don't. It had troubled me, would keep my stiff alive, my foot from freezing up, could have my dinner ready when I came from work, wash up, trim, fill my stinking blubber lamp, make my skin clothes and keep them in repair, work my boots, those temperamental Greenlandic chemics. Anne is described through her attractiveness, her unheroic labor, caring for Kent's daily needs, as well as through her deep affection for Kent, her time alone with him, her childlike behavior, along with the jealousy it inspired at Salamina. Sorry. You maybe remember the situation. Kent and Anna was out in a tent and some hunters were out hunting. And I quote, for presently Anna drew out through covertly the hidden magazine copy, opened it just a trifle and peeked in. I became all attention. Anna, let me see. She claps it shut and holds it tight again her breast. Come, let me see, I urge, and gently force it from her. I open it. Not Greta Garbo this time, not the king. Oh, it's me. A snapshot that I've given her, tucked into those pages, brought along with her. Anna has hung her head again. She's crying and she's laughing too. But also we have Greenlandic men in Salamina. In contrast to women, Greenlandic men are described as heroic, though sometimes childlike, although this varies at times. I quote, I had hoped in this story of Greenland to avoid overstressing the hardship of the life of the Greenlandic hunter. His land, the frozen north, his element, the sea, its risk, the storm, ice, the hazard of the hunt. These are enough to send a shiver through the spine. To play them up would be to melodramatize the North and to falsify completely the truth that they are undramatic every day to Greenlanders. The hunter takes his risk, endures his hardship easily. That's character. The presentation of Greenlandic men is a sharp contrast to Danish men of the colonial administration. Kent did not always have much left over for the Danes, whose only contribution to Greenland's population was order and cleanliness is perhaps the best contribution the Danish culture can make in Greenland, unquote. In particular, the Danish Board of Settlements in Islorsuit, he looks at with derision. The schools are a farce, your shop is a farce, and the Danish officials, and especially the settlement manager called Stjernebo, he also called him Trolleman, were in charge. Kent doesn't have much left over for him, mocking his many tattoos as sign of narcissism, exhibitionism, inspectionism, skin erotism, introversion, masochism, sadism, mutilation. Yeah. Unsurprisingly, Kent and some of his view were not received well in Denmark. The Danish explorer Knud Rasmussen, in a letter to his daughter, wrote, "My dear little Hanne, as a father, it's my duty to warn you. Watch out for Rockwell when you are coming home. I do not have a good impression of him in Greenland. Furthermore, he is so scrupulous and egoistic that you must be on guard toward him. your own father. This letter is a piece of a bigger story, and I think two males like Rasmussen and Kent was too much to be together in a house. Also, in the obituary of Stjernebo or Trolleman, which Kent spoke of in derogative terms, such as the fact that his career went from cabin boy to king in his Slottsvik, was referred to as ungrateful. And I quote, "The writer, Rockwell Kent, who thanks for his hospitality and help in many ways a year through, signed off a strange rudeness to him in a book, Salamina, a completely different thanks for the helpfulness got Rasmussen from the great universal Frank Greenland expedition, whose patron Knud Rasmussen was." There was some reactions to Salamina also in the United States. The lure of brave men and beautiful unmoral women through which Kent sought to draw the reader did seem to resonate in the USA. The New York Times review of Salamina in 1935 notes, and I quote, "Kent might be lucky that people in his Slottsvik don't read American books because they find, if they did, that he was outspoken both to those he admired and to those he didn't like. He had also been outspoken in talking about what happens to a white man who is temporarily free and unbound and who is in a small Greenlandic society where women have no concept of romantic love, but otherwise is very much like the demands-conscious sisters in the United States." You see, it's unfortunately it's not very good, but you can see a picture here, and it reads, "Can Rockwell come out, Mrs. Kent?" And you see 3 Greenlandic women waiting outside. So, and he ends, "Maybe it's good that Slottsvik it has to travel to. An American artist who plays ball with the feminine Eskimo hearts seem completely natural and right. 100 American artists could cruise international complications." And Susan will continue.
So how do we understand Kent's representations of Greenlandic women? Kent's description of Greenland, Greenlandic peoples, and Inuit women in many ways mirror and perpetuate the representations of the region and its people prominent in popular media in the first half of the 20th century. Kent's Greenland was a harsh, cold, and foreboding landscape of adventure films, a place of danger and action. It is a masculine Arctic of explorers, as described by Bloom, a theater of individual exploits and determination from which women were barred, a trope Bloom argues that contributed to legitimizing the exclusion of women from public domains in the West. Greenlandic society, particularly the way Kent envisioned it before colonization, was a model of communal and cooperative life in balance with the natural environment, which had been despoiled by modernity. This is a quote from Kent. "They are not today the children of nature that they were 2 centuries ago. They have unrest they want. And for glittering an aspect is even the first tentative advances of progress, that it casts into gloom all that which had light before. Progress began in Godthaab, which is today Nuuk, in 1721. 37 years later, it came to Uummannaq, and 13 years after that to Upernavik. It is said that Greenland, that the farther you go from the colonies, the better you will find the people. And it is said that the more northerly people are the best," end quote. Much like the popular accounts of the Arctic peoples, Greenlanders were in the past the people of nature, the baseline for comparison with Western progress. Although Kent did make exceptions here for particular individuals, and was somewhat reflexive on how the residents of Slottsvik saw him and outsiders, especially men which he regarded as friends. The Danish colonial administration and its employees, on the other hand, epitomized the degeneration wrought by progress, in the author's view. They were the foreign agent in Greenland, the corrupting force responsible for any ills in Greenlandic society. Kent himself, who was also an outsider, was somehow able to traverse both the modern world and the traditional world of Greenland, being able to comprehend, adapt to, and comment on both, a position that he did not afford to any other character in this account. Women were supportive characters in Salamina, given relevance and role in relation to men, particularly Kent himself. They were depicted as objects of desire, caretakers, and servants, often described as childlike or naive, again replicating many of the images of Indigenous women popular at the time. Kent was adamant that there was no concept of romantic love in Greenland, and the population was unencumbered by Western morality concerning sex. The women in Salamina are, for Kent, often agents of sex and desire for men, unencumbered by what he deemed as the ills of Western notions of love, which he again is somehow situated above. Kent's construction of Greenlandic women serves as a means through which he is able to level criticisms of Western morality and romantic love, part of his larger critique of the West, capitalism, and Fordism. However, Greenlandic women do not only serve as a canvas onto which Kent can paint his criticisms. They are also a means to sensationalize his account. His physical relationships with Greenlandic women were hinted at, but never overtly confirmed in Salamina, but served to draw in readers, just as such representations did in Arctic adventure melodramas popular in the cinemas at the time. Women were a facet of the exotic North, with sex as part of a thrilling adventure, used to draw in American audiences while not being so overt as to be considered immoral given the standards of the time. So what does any of this matter today? With the warming of the Arctic, a new frontier of resource exploitation, shipping routes, and possible military activity is often depicted as opening. The idea of the Arctic as a harsh, empty landscape to conquer reemerges here. Indigenous people are often left out or forgotten in such constructions, as are the effects of these activities on their lives. Indigenous women and girls are also disproportionately affected by gender-related violence, and crimes against them often receive less attention than that of non-Indigenous women. This can, at least in part, be traced to stereotypes of Indigenous women, such as those propagated through early representations of Inuit women as overtly sexual, naive, and corruptible. Finally, there has also been critiques of the binary gender system these representations imposed, and their neglect of Indigenous views on gender, sexuality, and sex, and that the continued resonance of this today in medical systems, as well as in wider stereotypes of Indigenous people. The recent Gender Equity in the Arctic report, and the wider program of which it is a part as part of the Arctic Council, has looked at these issues from a number of perspectives. Overall, this presentation is not to damn Kent or take away from his legacy, but is to understand him and his writings as complex. It is also to highlight the historical roots of representations, their relevance in the past, and their continued importance today. Thank you.
That's it, folks.
Questions for Jette or Susan?
Felicia? What? Oh. What is that?
Someone's chatting in there.
Susan is muted.
I just muted myself so you can't hear me breathing.
So raise their hand. I don't know if they can.
Issues?
I think they might need to chat.
Okay.
Use the chat. They're not using the chat.
Oh, open questions.
you want to tell them?
Hello.
Hello, Martin.
Oh, it's Martin Green in Seattle. And
Yes, hi.
I'm interested in Rockwell Kent and a Arctic historian and have been to Lorswit. I wanted to mention a couple things. First of all, Rockwell Kent, of course, was married when he went to Greenland. And his book, Salamina, which you showed a picture of, was published by Harcourt Brace in 1935. It had a picture of Salamina with bare breasts on the dust jacket, and a limited edition was published with 100 copies, and a few trade edition copies were published. And then the publisher withdrew the dust jacket, and it was too risque with bare breasts on the cover, and published the later editions in 1935 with a dust jacket that had a bird, a hawk on the cover. If you have an edition of the limited edition signed by Rockwell Kent with the bare-breasted Salamina, it may cost you $1,500 now. The other edition with the hawk on the cover you might get for $50. So that is interesting. Also, Jette, I did send you a picture of rockfall when I was in Ilorsuit in 2003. A large rock came down off the mountain and hit one of the buildings, and I sent you a picture of that. It's still happening there. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful talk.
Thank you for the comments.
Yeah, we didn't really want to get into Kent's interpersonal relationships with his wife, and because we can't actually talk to any of these women involved. But we have come across a lot of that, especially Jette in her archival research.
Yeah. Yeah, we wanted to frame our talk this today a little different as to the Arctic and the Arctic explorers and the gender relation across to that. So, well, we know of all the letters, and yeah, well, I've read most of them. Yeah.
I have a question about traditional Inuit culture.
The what?
Traditional Inuit culture.
Yeah.
In many traditional Indigenous North American cultures, male need for power and pride of place is channeled into pursuing personal and material resources required to be able to provide for family and community through generosity, rather than accumulation of material wealth.
Yeah.
Male children whose characters seem promising for becoming leaders, who could exemplify these values in adulthood, could be identified and cultivated for leadership roles by the women of the community. The sophisticated nature of these and other matriarchal cultural mechanisms, in concert with their own European biases, may have obscured the nature of the roles played by the women and made them somewhat occult for the colonizers. The traditional Inuit culture embodied these kinds of matriarchal values, and were they overlooked by the colonizers?
Could you say this last thing? Did you get it, Susan?
It's very echoey, so it's hard for me to hear.
Yeah, it's. Could you say the last? I heard most of it, but could you phrase it?
Traditional Inuit culture embodied those kinds of matriarchal values, and were those matriarchal values obscured for the European colonizers? You couldn't see them because of our cultural bias.
You ask if they were taking the what? I'm not sure I'm understanding.
I think you're making an important point, because again, looking at these relationships through a lens of an American in the 1930s, people were positioned in sort of structures of power, with men being sort of the breadwinner and the provider, and women being sort of these support structures for men and these endeavors. And I think you see that in Kent's work. Now, again, what women actually thought of their role, how they positioned themselves, and we're talking about a transition period as much as anything can be considered a transition period. Like, Greenland was in the midst of colonizing. There was a massive demographic shift. There was the start of fishing as an industry. So there were a lot of things going on that were already disrupting disrupted society and culture because of colonialism. So a lot of things were going on. I don't think it was Kent's goal to display all this complexity in his work. And I think he was much more focused on just analyzing it in terms of his critique of the West. But I agree, there's a lot more dynamics with Indigenous systems of sex and gender and that sort of thing that is missed in these kind of representations. Does that answer?
Was Inuit culture matriarchal and originally? And how was that expressed? How was the women's power?
I don't see
It's generally considered more egalitarian.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I think it would be, for questions like that, it's better to ask like Inuit researchers of Inuit culture. Like there's a whole group of people from Greenland that specialize in looking at like past Greenlandic culture.
Thank you.
But also in modern times, there hasn't been much talk about gender differences, because men had their job and women had their job, and both were sort of equal and necessary to each other. And of course, by modernity, many women had job outside the home also. And in modern Greenland, for instance, from my perspective, what I see in the university, we have 90% of women studying and almost none men, but they are trying to come in now. But many drops out because of other things they want to do. But so much in academic life in Greenland is driven by women now. So equality is not a big thing, but in that way.
Is there any way to paraphrase that discussion that you just did?
Yeah, I have.
Oh,
Susan,
with the man on the floor, he was asking, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. He was asking about how a lot of Indigenous cultures, when presented, especially in the historical accounts from explorers and outsiders, it looked at them as within the same sort of gender structure and hierarchy that you would see in Western countries at the time. So men kind of being the breadwinner and the support of the family and going out into the world, and women staying at home and taking care of children in the domestic sphere. And he was saying that missed out on a lot of specific ideas of gender and sexuality and roles in Indigenous cultures. And he said a lot of these, and I hope I'm doing justice, a lot of these Indigenous cultures were matriarchal. And he was asking if Greenland was matriarchal and what we know of that. And we said that Greenland has generally been described as egalitarian, and that there's a lot of really super Greenlandic researchers that look at these sort of past constructions of gender and sexuality and roles within the historical Greenlandic context.
Okay, and how long was Rockwell Kent there, and did he have children with any of these women?
Rockwell Kent was in Greenland 3 times. The first time was during his shipwreck in 1929. The second time was from 1931 to 1932, and that's when he lived, like that's what Salamina is based on. And then again from 1934 to 1935, and Jette can correct me. We don't know if, again, we didn't interrogate these specific relationships because there's nobody here we can ask about them. As far as we know, I can't say Kent had children here. I don't know. There's always speculation, both in the United States and in Greenland, but that I can't say that's anything more than speculation.
Okay.
Jette, if you want to add.
Officially, he had none, but between the lines, he had.
Between the lines, he had what?
Yeah, you're asking if he had children in Greenland. Officially, he had none. I mean, from the church church records and things like that. He had none, but rumors is that he, yeah.
Yeah,
You-
but they're nothing more than rumors. So
Well,
there's lots of rumors about lots of people. So I can't say either way.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. It's wonderful.
okay, thank you.
I'd like to thank Jette and Susan for being here and for this wonderful presentation. We're very happy to have you here. Now, if you would please join us, you can speak with Jette and Dennis Deffabaugh in front of the Burke Gallery about some of the workshops they did with the children in those communities. So if you would feel free to join us over in front of the Burke Gallery. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Jette.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.